So while I'm deeply engaged right now with creating a new offering, my body mapping video library, I wanted to bring back around some of the episodes of the Brilliant Body podcast that are so worth either hearing for the first time or experiencing again, because they're such beautiful conversations with these brilliant guests. And one of them is Professor Matthew Beaumont. And here we are having this fabulous conversation.
The idea that a colonial force like France in Algeria doesn't just occupy a country, it occupies the bodies of the inhabitants of that country. It gets right inside them. But it also implies, I think, a kind of congestion. To be occupied, to have your breathing occupied, is to have it stifled and to have it sort of thickened and become confined.
Hey, folks, welcome to the Brilliant Body Podcast, a forum to learn about and liberate the brilliance of your body and ultimately to expand the meaning and experience of intelligence. Join me, Mezey, and other body masters to explore pioneering and varied perspectives on what it means and feels like to be embodied. So many people feel disconnected from their bodies due to emotional or physical pain, or even conditioning and lack of education. Others feel quite at home in their bodies, yet want to learn to have more pleasure, awareness, and access to the body's guidance. This podcast is for everybody. Each one of my trailblazing guests has studied their own bodies and others' bodies for decades and will share their expertise and unique mission, how to thrive as a body. So join us and reclaim your body's brilliance. This is a first for me, speaking with somebody who's an academic and somebody I don't know for the Brilliant Body podcast. So I'm going to do my best at bringing my unique experience, very much aligned with what Professor Matthew Beaumont has been studying and exploring for his lifetime. He is a professor of English literature at University College London, is the author of several books for Verso, including Night Walking, A Nocturnal History of London, The Walker, on Finding and Losing Yourself in the Modern City, and How We Walk, Frantz Fanon and the Politics of the Body, just published this year, which is how I learned about him. He was speaking on BBC Radio, and I was immediately fascinated by his view of the body being an expression of politics and oppression just by how we move through the world, particularly those who are Black and brown bodies, and how that shows up in the physiognomy, in the gait, in the experience of walking, which of course is Homo sapiens and many species' most basic form of locomotion. So I get to talk to Matthew today about this and my own studies and fascination with how the body forms our lives and how our lives form our bodies. Are you there?
Hi,
Hey, Matthew.
nice to meet you. How are you doing?
To meet you too. Thank you so much for getting together with me and spending this time. I know you don't have a lot of it, so I'm
Yeah, I'm
all
sorry to squeeze us like that.
Yeah, no problem. I thought since you don't know me yet, and I
Yeah,
barely know you, I wanted
sure.
to explain a couple things before we launch in
Great.
to a shared fascination we both have, which is how the body expresses
Mm,
who we are in the world. And I am not an academic. I'm not a journalist.
mm,
I am basically a body person who has studied bodies and worked with bodies for the
mm,
last 43 years and worked with
mm,
my own for longer than that.
mm,
So I've always been quite fascinated by how our bodies form our lives and our lives form our bodies. And my elders that I was studying in my teenage years
mm.
were Reich and Alexander Lowen, these folks that you allude to in your book, How We Walk. And
Yeah,
so that was my beginning.
right.
And I
Yeah.
went and studied at Wellesley. I did an independent major called Aesthetics of the Human Form.
Oh,
So
right.
I did my stint in academia and
Yeah,
chose not to continue in it, which is
yeah.
part of the topic I want to begin with. But
Mm,
It was very much about how our bodies reflect our personalities and also our cultures. So that's where I begin
Right.
from.
Yeah.
You, on the other hand, obviously pursued academia with a vengeance, or maybe not a vengeance, but with a passion, and going
Yeah.
through Oxford and now still continuing to teach. And I just wanted to start with how different it is for me, for example, to begin reading your book and how it feels in my body to think that way, to think in the way that you're deeply steeped in and expert at, and how different that is from my usual way of being in the body and even thinking through my body. Because this loops back around to the Cartesian divide and how much we emphasize and reward academic thinking,
Mm,
left brain thinking, and your love of Fanon, who you write about,
mm.
Frantz Fanon, am I pronouncing his name
Yeah.
correctly?
Yeah. Absolutely.
You express a lot, even in the first chapter, about how body-based his way of thinking and writing is. So I'm just curious about how these books you've been writing about walking and the
Mm.
body have affected or helped you notice how you think and what kind of pushback you may or may not have gotten throughout your life when you're wanting to bring the body into your studies, your art, and your expression.
That's a really interesting question. Um, I mean, it's certainly the case that for professional reasons, I'm overly invested, as it were, in the mind rather than the body, to repeat that Cartesian split. There's a vision in the late 19th century from people like H.G. Wells, the great British novelist and writer of science fiction, where he pictures people becoming more and more brain heavy, as it were. He sees the division of labor that was apparent in the 19th century becoming more and more polarized, that division of labor between the hand workers and the head workers, between those who worked in factories or artisanal contexts and those who use their brains in offices or universities or wherever it might be. So he has this sort of science fiction vision of the polarization of those two functions of the human being, whereby one develops the body completely at the expense of the brain, and on the other hand, develops the brain at the expense of the body, and the body becomes kind of useless. And so I'm aware that as an academic, I can overprivilege, if you like, the mind, and writing and reading and researching is a sedentary activity. So that reinforces this. But I've always been interested in walking. I've always done a lot of walking. And I suppose as I got more confident in career terms, as I matured, as I became more and more aware of my body and its malfunctions, and after all, one only really begins to become aware of one's body when it starts to malfunction. You know, it's the prerogative of the young not to have to think too much about their bodies. I got more and more interested in the ways in which it might be possible to integrate it into my research and thinking and writing, I suppose. And I became more conscious of thinking about what I was doing when I was performing everyday activities like walking or running or swimming or whatever it might be, and became more and more interested in anthropologists from the early 20th century, such as Marcel Mauss, the French anthropologist, who thought of bodies as cultural rather than, in some uncomplicated sense, natural entities. So he wrote a very important essay in 1935 called Technique du Corps, the techniques of the body, where he said that things like swimming, like walking, are learned. We assume that we walk quite spontaneously, that it's a natural activity. And in one sense, it is, in that it is something that we do without thinking. It's something that is central or structural to our evolution as a species, from being primates who used their hands as well as their feet to walk. But as Marcel Mauss points out, it's also something that we learn when we're very small, when we're infants. And as such, it is a cultural phenomenon, not just a natural one. And as a cultural phenomenon, it is influenced by the world we inhabit, the world with which it's constantly interacting. So I suppose, yes, I became more and more interested in that interrelationship between the body and the world, and the way in which thinkers and writers have tried to represent that relationship or explore its contradictions.
Mm. There's so many things I want to respond to. One is, I was just thinking about how much longer it takes humans to learn how to walk than it does many mammals that immediately get up on their feet or hooves or whatever they may have.
Mhm.
And the other thing I was so struck by, even in your first chapter, is how you're describing that we have to consciously learn to walk so that we can become unconscious of it, only to eventually, for some races, genders, disabled folks, have to become increasingly conscious of walking again, at least in public, because of the potential dangers of being in most cultures in the world, or many, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's right. I like your point about the fact that other animal species don't take as long to learn to walk. That's absolutely right. Freud makes the point, in a sense, when he says that human beings are born prematurely. Human beings, unlike most other species, just aren't equipped to inhabit the world when they're born. So they're much more reliant. And if they had 9 months more in the womb, maybe they'd be capable of springing out and, marching off immediately. They wouldn't need to rely on their parents and their carers nearly so much. So I think that's a really, really important point. It's something that does have to be learned consciously. It's something they have to be trained to do, usually by parents who, guide the infant as it walks between the two of them, or between one of them and a table or chair, whatever it might be. It's because we assimilate that activity, and because it does appear so natural to us, because we do it without thinking, we forget that we had to learn it, just as we had to learn language. And it might not be quite as complex a function as language, but it requires an enormous amount of coordination. We tend to forget that. Yes, you're right. My book is really about the ways in which, in a certain context, certain people become self-conscious about walking again for all the wrong reasons. So if, as you say, learning to walk is about rendering unconscious the conscious activity of walking, then for certain minoritized groups in society, that's a privilege that they don't necessarily have. So if you are a woman walking alone at night, say, back to your apartment, then your whole body will betray the fact that that is not something that you can do unthinkingly. You have to be very conscious of what you project in moving your body. You might have to project confidence, for example, and that would involve, I don't know, expanding your body and striding in order to deter potential attackers or abusers, whatever it might be. Or on the other hand, it might involve making yourself small so that you don't get noticed so much. And those processes too become automated in a way, rather sadly. Women get used to having to find defense techniques. Similarly, racialized minorities, who are the focus of my book because of my interest in Frantz Fanon, as you say, have a very different relationship to their bodies and to apparently simple activities like walking in the context of a city street, say, because they might easily be subjected to racialized abuse, to racist policing, to all those kinds of things, which I have to say I'm fortunately comparatively exempt from as a white middle-aged man. So in a sense, I'm hesitant about speaking for other people who are in a less privileged position than me, who have a more embattled time than me, women, Black and Asian people, for example. So yes, I'm very, very conscious of that. But for all of us, I think, in certain circumstances, we have to adapt our bodies and we have to become self-conscious again. So I'm trying to listen to those moments and track those moments where the body becomes something that we can't take for granted anymore.
Hmm. I know certainly from my own experience, one, I very much relate to how aware of my body I am whenever I'm out in public, particularly at night. I've also always been aware because I've had injuries since I was young. And I was also raised as a dancer, and I've also just super body oriented. So I'm always feeling my body, almost always, I should say, unless I'm sitting at a screen, at a
Mm.
computer screen, or very distracted by someone else.
Mm.
But one of the things that I wanted to really emphasize was Fanon's phrase, politics of anatomy and physiology, I found particularly interesting in light of Stephen Porges, his polyvagal theory, and how our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems are affected by our arousal states, in this case, by feeling potential threat out in the world as a different skinned person or different gendered person in any given context. And I was thinking a lot about how shallow breathing, tensed muscles, tends to raise the breath higher up into the body, shallower, and that can be perceived as predation.
Mm.
Predators tend to breathe more shallowly before they're about to pounce.
Mm.
And how often Black and brown people are perceived as being predators, even if they are doing their best to try to be as invisible as possible. So I was just really thinking about that, reading your work about how our physiology ties into how we're perceived in
Mm.
terms of potential, or projected, I should say, threat.
Mm. Yeah, that's fascinating. I agree with you. Absolutely. I agree with your diagnosis. Fanon, who was this Martinican thinker in the 40s and 50s, who died quite young in the early 1960s after he'd become involved in the Algerian War of Independence. Fanon was, as you say, very interested in, well, he was very interested in bodies, but also in breathing, to come back to your point about breath. And he talks, for example, about what he calls occupied breathing.
Yes.
And it's a really rich phrase, I think, because he's thinking about occupation in the political or colonial sense, the idea that a colonial force like France in Algeria doesn't just occupy a country, it occupies the bodies of the inhabitants of that country. It gets right inside them. But it also implies, I think, a kind of congestion. To be occupied, to have your breathing occupied, is to have it stifled and to have it sort of thickened and become confined. And there's always in Fanon a very interesting doubleness, I think, to his linguistic register. The metaphors he uses are at once physiological and political, which is why it does make sense to talk about a politics of anatomy, to talk about, as I suggest in the book, an orthopedic politics, a politics of how you carry your body, how straight your back is. Fanon, in the same passage where he talks about occupied breathing, talks about combat breathing, which comes back to another of the points that you were making so interestingly a moment ago. So the colonized person, under certain political and social conditions, Fanon thinks, can, if you like, metabolize the state of occupied breathing so that it becomes combat breathing. So that shallowness, that tension, which he sees also in the muscles. So he's constantly talking about how the muscles of the colonized are tensed. That tension can have an offensive and positive as well as a defensive and negative inflection. And a combat breathing, he thinks, might actually help people to combat or to throw off an oppressor. That state of permanent tension that people who are racialized and colonized live with can actually be converted into something more productive.
Mm. It's interesting you use the word metabolized, because in trauma work, when we experience trauma or the ongoing trauma of oppression, for example, we are challenged to continually metabolize and keep our nervous system within the window of tolerance, as it's called. And when we can't, we either go into parasympathetic collapse, for listeners who don't know about this, or go into the sympathetic and stay in that hyped, cortisol state that can go into fight, can go into violence, can go into, as you're talking about in combat, downright war, aggression, rape, all these highly aggressive modes of interacting with the world because of not being able to metabolize ultimately what is going on internally.
Mhm.
So I don't know, I'm thinking about that in terms of trauma and when the body gets to a point where it has no other option than to either explode or go into collapse to the point of even death
Mhm.
through its own means or by circumstances that create some sort of demise for the body that can no longer tolerate life on planet Earth, you know?
Mhm. Mhm.
So, in a day and age of so much oppression and people feeling so unable to metabolize what's going on in their life, personally, I'm finding climate change extremely difficult to metabolize. And something that I'm noticing is taking up quite a lot of energy on a daily basis, consciously, only to the extent that I have the courage to basically face it. But I am very curious about how do we deal with all the different kinds of oppressions that just being human on the earth challenge us with. Obviously, being Black, brown, Asian, differently gendered, disabled are going to have even more challenges to the body and intercultural interactions than many of us contend with. What are your thoughts about that and perhaps your own personal experience? I mean, it sounds like walking 8 or 9 miles a day is one of the ways you metabolize
I
your
suppose
world.
that's true. Yeah,
Ah,
it is a way of metabolizing whatever energies are bubbling away in me, including no doubt anger. It's a way of containing but also releasing those energies. I couldn't agree with you more in your analysis, and also, yeah, I'm fascinated by your point about climate change as well. I've got a friend who, in fact, he's quite a lot younger than me. He used to babysit my kids when they were small, but he's written a book about the impact of climate change on his mental health and his body, because he thought that more needed to be said about the way in which his generation, he might be 30 now, late 20s, 30, have grown up with this state of tension, with this dread, with this doom, constantly being told that everything's too late, that they can't do anything, that they're powerless. That's very, very debilitating. And I don't think it was the only reason for this friend of mine, called Charlie Young, for his own mental health problems, which in fact led to a suicide attempt more than once and to him losing the lower part of his legs. But climate change and his anxiety over that was definitely an important factor in it. I'm jumping about a bit here, but the other context that we should bear in mind here is the pandemic, is the impact of the pandemic, and the way in which that has changed our relationship to our bodies, the way in which that has altered our relationship to breathing, the way it altered our relationship to walking when we were locked down and our freedom of movement was officially confined. I suppose breathing is the most striking, though, of physiological problems associated with the pandemic, because even if one didn't have the virus, and if one did, then one's breathing was certainly compromised to a greater or lesser extent. But even if one didn't, one's supposedly unthinking activities like breathing were radically transformed by the fear of inhaling spores or the virus or whatever it might be.
wearing
So
masks.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, wearing masks. So that was a very obvious sort of visual correlative of this changed relationship to breathing. I mean, not least because of wearing a mask, we became conscious of not just of breathing in, but of breathing out. We could smell our own breath in a way that we don't if we don't wear a mask. And you can feel the condensation, the moisture, etc., etc. So we were projected into these very uncomfortable, all too intimate relationships, not only with other people's bodies, but with our own during the pandemic. And we're still coming to terms with that, probably not nearly consciously and systematically enough. It's so easy to forget what it was like in the pandemic. So, yeah, in all of these ways, one might say that climate change, the pandemic, the rise of racism and sexism, which have such a debilitating effect on people in their everyday lives, physically as well as psychologically. Perhaps we're at some kind of a crisis point. I don't know, in terms of our collective relationship to our bodies. I'd be interested to know what you what you think, or whether I'm being too apocalyptic there.
Unfortunately, you have a kindred spirit here. One of the big reasons I moved to Scotland was keeping climate change in mind. I mean, I joke about it with friends, but it's not really a joke. I'd much rather be here than in burning California or all kinds of other places. I've personally been deeply touched by the climate change there and elsewhere. So I don't think I experience the colonization of all bodies by industrialism, basically,
Mm,
which I have distinctly, palpably felt my whole life. So I don't have to be worried about being, handcuffed and thrown up against a car or imprisoned, though I certainly have to worry about being attacked as a
mm,
woman
mm,
and have a lot of my life. But I'm talking about the more subtle aspects that happen to us from very early on. You have children, so I'm
mm,
sure you remember what it was like when they were jumping all around like crazy people, expressing every whim of their physical
mm,
existence, just exploring their bodies and being silly and experimental. And what happens to our bodies, in my view, it is a colonization when we go
mm,
to school systems where we have to sit in desks,
mm,
we stop moving around. Then in puberty, we get even more restricted in how we move as our bodies develop and become more sexually alluring or attractive or not. That
mm,
very much affects how we move. I mean, personally, if I didn't feel the constant pressure and inhibition of cultural acceptable physical movement, I would be moving around in all kinds of ways. I would be jumping around and moving. I'd be dancing. I'd be
mm,
expressing myself in so many ways that are just not acceptable. Almost nobody does that.
mm,
Almost no adult does that. So I personally feel like we've all been colonized by adulthood, at least industrialized adulthood. I don't know what it's like if you're still living in an untouched part of the jungle or somewhere, but certainly westernized culture and Middle Eastern culture, from what I can see, and Asian culture, unless you are an artist who's performing and allowed to express through the body, we're fucking locked down most of the time.
mm,
I am. And
mm,
I find that incredibly oppressive.
mm.
So that's my view on it. I'm
Yeah,
quite passionate
yeah,
and I suffer a lot from it, you
yeah.
know?
So you couldn't have put that more eloquently. I agree. And lockdown is a good metaphor for what
Absolutely.
happens to us, not just in pandemic situations, but from the moment we're socialized, in a sense. The body does get locked down. That's absolutely right. It's subject from a very, very early stage, from weeks or months into our life, to a whole series of prohibitions. And those prohibitions only pile up more and more the older you get, and you only internalize them more and more as they accumulate, I think. So it
Yeah.
starts when you're crawling and you're first mobile and in that oral phase of development, as Freud would have called it, and you want to put everything in your mouth and you want to touch and you want to feel things on your lips and you want to taste things. And you're immediately, again, partly because of the risk of infection, parents' fears that you might become infected, you're subject to these endless prohibitions. No, don't do that. No, you get picked up and put somewhere safe. And from then on, it's downhill, frankly. It's more and more prohibitions, more and more limitations. And as you say, as a result, we lose our ability not just to feel that we can express ourselves through dance, for example, but we lose our ability to dance, or certainly to integrate dance into everyday life. I mean, I'm not suggesting we should all dance down the street, but
Some
there's a
of
lot
us
to be
would
said for
love
it.
to do
There's a
that.
lot to be said for it. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
wouldn't it make the streets so much more entertaining?
Oh, so much.
Instead of us all walking around with our phones in front of our faces, not looking where we're going, if people dance through the street, everyday life might be a lot more interesting as well as expressive and liberating. And Fanon, just quickly to come back to him before we move on. Yeah, he was very interested in dance and in the way in which
Hmm.
Algerians, for example, particularly not in an urban context, there were certain rituals that they performed involving dancing, which were designed to both release and contain aggression and energy, physical and libidinal energy, and how that was a really good thing, but how it might be more integrated into everyday life, not just ghettoized as part of an exceptional ritual or something that takes place at a festival, for example.
This is really interesting, the word ritual in that context, because to me it implies, maybe not, because ritual can also be an amazing way to pass on culture through generations. So I don't want to color it as being necessarily a controlled substance, so to speak, or
Mm,
practice in a culture. But there is something to that, having spent several years in Niger, so
mm,
right next to Algeria. And the dance that I experienced there, not a dissimilar culture, also colonized by France,
mm,
the segregation between the men and the women was pretty intense. Ritual, dance,
mm,
hanging out, physically being in contact was extremely segregated. You
mm,
know, weddings would happen and the women would go into one dwelling and the men would go into the other, and then dance would happen. That was that particular culture. Obviously, it's not like that everywhere, but I do find this interesting, the use of ritual and dance to help metabolize, communicate, convey cultural wisdom and values, express aggression, as you say, also express libidinal forces and energies, and also to pray and to celebrate and to go into altered state, all these things. I'm just curious about having to ritualize, having to design how we as different societies are allowed to be highly physical,
mm,
whether it's through performance or ritual or athletics. It's very prescribed. It's still controlled. It's weird. I'm using that term again, but it's a controlled substance, so to speak. It's a
mm,
controlled energy. Then we start getting into the church and the effect of religion on how we experience our bodies, and if our bodies are allowed to move as they want to, how quickly that brings up erotic energies that then we humans don't seem to navigate very well. So this is perhaps spinning out into greater and greater spirals of conversation here and exploration, but lobbing that over the screen and seeing what you think about any of it.
Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think there's a good reason why, just to think about dance as a ritual, why historically and in some cultures, still in more Puritan cultures, as it were, it's prescribed or prohibited one way or another because it's very dangerous. You know, dancing and free movement of all kinds is extremely dangerous, and because it generates fears of uncontrollability, particularly associated with sexuality, of course. It's destabilizing for societies if movement is done uninhibited and creative.
Or
So
it's feared to be destabilizing.
yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So even supposedly liberatory forms of dancing, I don't know, in a Western urban culture, so going to a club on a Friday or Saturday night and taking MDMA or something like that, you know, that too has to be kind of contained. That's a semi-acceptable form of containing and ghettoizing dance and physical liberation. But yeah, if it wasn't confined to nightclubs on a Friday or Saturday night, it might, you know, it might erupt in all sorts of unexpected
Mm.
places and cause all sorts of problems. So any kind of collective bodily expression, I think, is fascinating and threatening. And we are so atomized in the West socially that really the only way in which we do collectively experience our bodies is through dancing in clubs or halls or concerts, whatever it might
Athletics.
be.
Yeah, and athletics.
Yeah, athletics, that's absolutely true. And then you're right that religion does play a role in channeling these energies, and not the Church of England in the UK, for example, which or the Church of Scotland, which are pretty staid and puritanical and tend to sublimate away from the body. But you know, revivalist and evangelical forms of Christianity, for example, do involve a lot of bodily expression, and I mean, are designed to contain that as well as to tease it out.
I want to loop back around now to churches, and specifically Black churches that I've visited, and how much more animated and physical, at least American Black churches seem to be. The ones I've experienced definitely are, in contrast to stuffy white churches where everybody's sitting on really hard seats, trying to barely move and barely breathing and barely having any kind of expression. And then at least the vestiges of a much freer culture once upon a time, of Black culture that's so much more in general expressive than white culture has been for, millennia.
Mm.
Just curious whether Fanon's talked about that, having come from the Caribbean, spending a lot of time in Northern Africa,
Mhm.
and the freedom, the relative freedom that may be expressed within all Black communities, as opposed to what happens when a Black person interfaces with the white world.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I'm not sure he does. I may need to be corrected. I mean, I wonder if that's the case, that it's because of Fanon's atheism that
Mm.
he sort of steered clear of that, which is a pity in a way, because I think he would have had an awful lot to say. It's very interesting that the role that the body plays collectively in certain Black churches. And unlike you, I haven't actually visited any, so my my experience is really very much secondhand and was restricted to movies and TV, which makes me a very crude commentator on this. But on the one hand, it seems to me you've got a really quite expressive form of physical articulacy going on at those meetings and services, and that's to be lauded and applauded. And indeed, I grew up in the Church of England before myself becoming an atheist in my mid teens. And I've always felt slightly jealous, felt slightly envious of those church meetings, in spite of my atheism, because of the sheer joyous corporate identity that they inculcate and enact. So I do really sort of understand, I think, what's going on there in one sense, the positivity of it. On the other hand, that bodily movement is very much in the service of a higher being, erratic being in the form of the priest, but obviously the highest being of all being God. So this is the idea of being possessed rather than occupied, as it were. And by possessed, I don't mean in some satanic sense, but in the way that at evangelical meetings or revivalist meetings, people might speak in tongues, or they might move apparently involuntarily because they are possessed by the Spirit of God.
Mm.
And that seems to me a slightly frightening thing. And obviously, I'm not alone in finding speaking in tongues, finding physical convulsions at those kinds of events quite uncanny, quite unsettling, as if the body is being possessed by something other than itself. And that liberates the body, but it also imprisons it in some way. I think it
Why?
takes
Why do
it
you, why do
well, I
you?
think it takes it away from the individual subject as well as giving it to them, if you see what I mean. So
Okay, so I'm gonna be edgy here
yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
you've already told us that you're an atheist. So on
Mm,
one hand, I can understand, I could imagine that that concern can bleed into whatever your feelings and perspectives might be on God and attributing power and control to this patriarchal force, et cetera, et cetera.
mm.
But how is that different? And you may not want to answer this, but giving over to sexual ecstasy, to merging with another person, for example, where you may not feel in control. How is that similar or different? And then how much are we able to not fear? You could even go so far as to say the disintegration of ego.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I take your point. I mean, there isn't such a huge difference. I suppose I might slightly feebly say that ceding of autonomy that takes place and the evacuation of individuality and the autonomy over one's body that takes place in the sexual act is interpersonal on the whole, and is more manageable, more consensual perhaps. But already I'm on slightly slippery ground, I grant you. And perhaps there isn't so much difference after all. I mean, maybe both things are quite frightening. I,
Maybe. And I think that comes back to the church ultimately too. Shut that shit down because we don't know what it is. It's too overwhelming. Sex can't be controlled within oneself. It can't be controlled in society. It can't be controlled politically, or it needs to be controlled politically.
but
And
the
so
obvious irony being that it mimics that, having some kind of fit in front of a congregation as a way of manifesting and dramatizing an extremely intimate relationship to God is, it's highly sexual. I mean, that's completely obvious. Yeah. So
It's fascinating, isn't it?
yeah, yeah.
I
And you
think
only
it's
have to
so
think of another example, not just about the revivalist congregations, but I don't know if you know that famous Bernini sculpture,
yeah, I
17th
was
century.
just thinking
Yeah,
that.
right.
Yes.
Yeah. Famous 17th century sculpture of St. Teresa of Avila,
Yes.
one of the greatest of all Baroque sculptures, in which she is in what is quite clearly an orgasmic, erotic
The
pose
ecstasy
in
of Saint
relation
Teresa.
to God. Yeah.
Absolutely. Gosh. Yeah, this comes back to the Cartesian divide. I wrote a whole paper on that in college about Descartes. I blamed it on him quite a bit, but now I
Mm,
appreciate more that he was in this context in which he had a lot of pressure by the church. There's all kinds of pressures to try
mm,
to disidentify with the body. The body's scary, it dies.
mm,
And
mm,
of course, we want to objectify it in ways and believe that it's not what we are because it
mm,
stops being who we are
mm,
in a relatively short period of time. But
mm, mm,
yeah, it's an amazing thing. Anything else you want to add to this, and specifically how this conversation may or may not relate to your book? It's very important to me to really honor and emphasize the effect, the influence of racial oppression on the body. So that deserves more time. And I'm also really curious how much of this exquisite exploration you've done through your books have to do with, you mentioned having mixed race children, and how that may or may not be your way of empathizing and
yeah.
vicariously imagining that stress and wanting to understand it
Mm,
more as
mm.
a white person.
Yeah, it's funny.
And
I do mention that in the preface to the book, but I haven't really given it a lot of thought. So I'm quite grateful to you for raising it. I think, in a way, it is an attempt to empathize with my son's racialized status. One of them's quite a lot darker than the other, actually. So they have different experiences
Mhm.
themselves. And it's also, I suspect, I fear, an atonement, a sort of atonement of liberal guilt. So maybe it is a response to my children. It's also a response to Black Lives Matter. And I'm fairly frank about that. I've been thinking about race all my life. I grew up in South London in a privileged background, but I grew up in a culturally and racially quite diverse area of London. So I began to become conscious of racial difference relatively early on. And when I was politically very active in my late teens and 20s, I was often involved in campaigns against police brutality and that kind of thing. So when Black Lives Matter happened, when George Floyd was murdered, et cetera, nothing surprised me, but it consolidated a lot of what I thought and pushed me a lot further and made me think much, much more about these issues, about what happens when bodies get racialized and brutalized in societies which purport to be very civilized and sophisticated, and to have moved far beyond that really crude phase of racism. And then the pandemic, no doubt, fed into it a bit too, for the reasons we were discussing earlier, because we all became more conscious of our bodies. That and the onset of middle age,
Yeah,
or maybe I'm in the middle of middle age, and the fact that my knee started to give way and I had to have an operation. Yeah, all these kinds of things make one think about the body and how one lives it. And I was going to say how one relates to it, but that statement is obviously predicated on a Cartesian split, so one would
thank you
want
for
to
saying that.
avoid exactly that. Yeah. Fanon, just to come back to your question about Fanon, whether there was anything else, he's not just invested in thinking about the oppressive nature of the racialization of bodies, the way it involves tension and bent back and general defensive posture. He is, as we've perhaps already implied, in talking about a combat breathing as well as an occupied breathing. And I'd extend that and say that there's such a thing as a combat walking as well as an occupied walking, that there are ways of expressing oneself really positively and self-empowering ways when one walks. One doesn't necessarily just have to be defensive. He's interested in what happens to women during the Algerian Revolution and wrote a very fascinating article called Algeria Unveiled, in which he describes, admittedly in slightly idealized, romanticized terms, but he describes how women at the height of the Algerian War of Independence, women who had worn veils then had to take off the veil in order to smuggle goods or weapons or messages into the French quarter in Algiers from the Arab quarters. So they had to imitate Europeans. And in doing so, in becoming involved in a militant campaign to end oppression and in taking off the veil, there was a kind of liberation that took place of their bodies in imitating the more fluid, the less confined and restricted movements of French colonial women in Algiers. They actually began to develop more physical confidence themselves, more freedom, more fluidity. Now, he wasn't saying the westernization of these women is a good thing and the veil should be taken off them because that will automatically liberate them. Clearly, that would be politically quite dangerous along the lines of, I don't know, French culture today, where young Muslim girls aren't allowed to wear veils in school, etc., etc. So it wasn't a narrative just of sort of secularization, westernization is good, that will liberate women's bodies. He was much more interested in how, under very specific political circumstances, there might be opportunities for empowerment through the process of adaptation, physical adaptation to particular political situations.
And I gathered from what you wrote about it too, is that in the process of observing the change of gait and actual movement of these women, he also came to have more respect for women, which apparently he was somewhat anemic in
Yeah.
prior. So I thought that was also a really interesting juxtaposition of transformation, you know?
Yeah, you're right. It's an encouraging aspect of the process of politicization that took place for him. I think he did start to interrogate his own sexism and arguably misogyny. He was invested in quite a macho type of masculinity up until that point as a result of witnessing that. And he, as I point out in the book, that the whole way in which he wrote his books is premised on his own movement, mobility of movement, and the restricted movement of women, because he interestingly dictated his books rather than wrote them. So he didn't sit at a desk writing them. He
Loved that
walked up and
whole
down.
thing.
He walked
Yes.
up and down. And so one of the wonderful things about reading him is that his prose, as a result, is inflected by the energies of a walking, and often quite an agitated walking body. And it has some of the rhythms of walking as well as of the grammatical sentence, as it were. But that's all very well and good, but he could only do that. He could only write quite liberating and exciting prose on the basis of his walking movements because there was a woman, often his wife, otherwise a secretary, sitting there taking down what he was saying. So yeah, so that that rather painful irony has to be respected.
There is a whole conversation I'd love to have with you about, in an earlier episode, I do a whole conversation with Joseph Culp, who co-founded Walking in Your Shoes, which is
Ah,
a healing method that liberates what the body knows through the process of walking. So
mm.
if we ever get to talk again in the future, or hopefully you'll listen to it, I highly
I will
recommend
do,
it,
absolutely.
because Fanon was up to something else while he was walking, in my view. He was necessarily liberating and contacting, if not, you could even say channeling the intelligence of his body in ways that just sitting there in this sort of brain in a jar method
Mm,
that most of
mm,
us use when we write
mm,
may not have been able to contact and
mm,
express.
mm,
But
mm,
we have
mm.
to save that for another time. It
Right. Well,
looks
please send. Will you send me that episode? Because
I
I'd.
would love to. I would
Yeah,
love to.
good. I'd love
We'll
to
have
listen.
all of these references in the show notes. So really quick last two
Yeah.
questions. Do you have a definition for embodiment?
Oh God, I
It can be personal too. It doesn't have to be academic, but it could be either.
not off the top of my head, except to say that embodiment. This goes back to something we talked about right at the beginning, or that I said right at the beginning, which is embodiment always involves pain. To the extent that embodiment is consciousness of the body, it always involves pain, and I don't mean that necessarily in a bad sense. To the extent that the body is in pain or is palpable, perhaps that's putting it a bit more neutrally, it's something we can listen to and tune our attention to. So yeah, embodiment is insofar as it's about the registration and manifestation of our physicality in social context, is all about pain, discomfort. But that needn't be a bad thing. That too can be metabolized, it
Ooh,
seems to me.
that begs so many questions about whether we can only be conscious, palpably conscious, if we are in some kind of pain differential.
Mm.
But you've got to
I
go.
know.
So
I'm sorry. I've dropped a kind of little bomb, and I probably want to retreat from it myself. So don't hold me above it.
okay, that's a dot 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 there. Last question for now anyway is what do you like best about being your body?
Ah, what do I like best about being in my body or being
Well,
my
there's
body?
there's that there's that Cartesian divide.
Yeah, I know. I was trying to catch you out. Being my body. I don't know the fact that there are moments when it does the thinking for me, I suppose. That if I'm swimming, for example, in cold water, and I've swum 20 lengths or something, or if I'm walking and I've walked a long distance, suddenly it's as if the body takes over and starts doing the thinking for me, by which I mean that my consciousness gets hitched to my body again in a way that it isn't ordinarily,
Mm, love
or it
it.
joins up with it again. I mean, yeah, to say hitched implies that they're separate again, but so yeah, it's as if the relations get organically reconstituted.
And
Uh,
merged, it sounds like.
yeah, merged. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a good way
Mm,
to. Yeah.
love it. Matthew, this has been such a pleasure and such an honor. I have to say that you would take the time, give the time to be with me and explore these topics.
No, huge pleasure for me, Ali, and to have such intelligent conversation with someone who's from a different background from me in all sorts of ways is really terrific. So thank you.
Well, likewise, because I tend to poo-poo the word crunching of the intellect a lot, and I forget how much I actually really enjoy it and miss it. So thank you
Good,
for such an enriching
good,
conversation,
good.
and I hope it is to be continued one way or
Yes,
another.
likewise. Yeah, I'm really
And of
happy.
course, I really, really encourage listeners to read How We Walk and other books by Matthew Beaumont. All the links will be in the episode notes. And just here we keep going as bodies, hopefully as freely as possible. So
Right,
thank
so
you again.
good. Thank you, Ali. Take care. Bye
You
bye.
Thanks so much for sticking around till the end. If you enjoyed this episode, please give that like button a little click. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. I've got a bunch of fascinating guests lined up with trailblazing experts in the field that I'm really excited to share with you. I'm eager to hear from you too, so don't be shy. Drop a comment below. Share your thoughts, suggestions, or just say hi. Your insights on this episode mean the world to me. So go ahead, spread some love, like, subscribe, hit the bell, and share your thoughts below. Your support keeps this channel going strong, and I'm genuinely grateful for each and every one of you. Till next time, stay brilliant. I hope you found this episode inspiring. If you'd like to learn more about the many ways I'm encouraging and guiding the wider world to reclaim the brilliance of the body, please visit my website at www.alimezey.com. Thanks so much for listening. Until the next episode and beyond, reclaim your brilliant body. The Brilliant Body podcast was created by Ali Mezey. This episode was co-produced and edited by Ali Mezey and Florence Popoff. Thanks to composer Blair, Mr. One Man Band Wilson for my theme music.